So it's Monday. I'm glad to see all of you are up and out of bed and feeling bright eyed and bushy tailed, enjoying going to work. I'm not. I'm just sitting here in my living room or my dining room or wherever the hell I am. It's one of the disadvantages of getting old. You never know where you really are. The advantage is you don't really care. Now, I'm really working at home all the time, which is why I've been sort of in absentia, as we say in Latin, because I've been working on a case that I have going on in San Diego. But still, it's kind of fun to not have to put on a suit and tie and drive to the office, sit down with no computers. Actually, see, those weren't such bad days. But I remember when somebody came to our office with this fancy computer thing where you could actually type things on a computer. And, what? I just bought the electric typewriters. You could type it, and then you could print them out. And I'm like, I looked at my partner and said, no one's ever going to buy this. It's way too expensive, and who needs it? We have electric typewriters. Hello? Welcome to the 20th century. Okay, that was the one time in my life that I was wrong. Well, the other one was I said these automobiles would never go anywhere. They'd never replace my horse and carriage. And yet, here I am today. I'm not going so far as to buy a Tesla. You can forget that. I'm sitting in a garage for hours on end, charging up my car like my friend Mikey, who swears by his Teslas. He just have what he's got many of them. There's a reason he has to keep buying Teslas, because he made the mistake of buying stock in that company years ago, and he's made a few $1 million. But so what? Anybody could do that. I could have done that. Yeah, I know, he told me to. This is not a session for me to sit here and whine and cry. I can do that the rest of the day. This is to talk to you about this strange alliance that's become the Republican Party today. And just think about this. When you look at the map of the United States, what do you see is the former Confederate States of America is now the red state of America. Then you have, but that includes, in addition to the Confederate States, where they're all in there now. But you have a few other states in there which are aligned philosophically with the Confederate States of America, and always were. And those include particularly the border states of Ohio and Indiana. And I've lived in both, so I have a pretty good idea what I'm talking about here. My nose itches. That means I'm going to get rich. Yes, all right. And none too soon either. So, and then you have the states that were largely populated by Southerners in the immediately before the Civil War and the immediate aftermath, and I'm talking about Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, Idaho, the Montana, Wyoming, all the cowboy states. And there was a reason for that. Before it was because the southern states were trying to encourage these people who were farmers to go farm in Nebraska and Kansas, all these territories that they knew someday would become part of the United States, and they wanted them to come in as slave states. So they'd each have 2 senators, and those 2 senators would be solidly in support of slavery, because they were always paranoid, and with good reason, about the North coming in, the other states coming in and trying to get rid of their slaves. So, but how do you account for the fact that the South used to be solidly Democratic? Well, that's easy. They hated Abraham Lincoln. And that was the Republicans who, in charge of the grand old party of the Republic, which was, put the knee on the South, as they see it, and told them they had to get rid of their slaves. Oh, God forbid. But then you have, these swing states, Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan. So how do you account for those? Well, the way you account for those is, to a large extent, the same kind of attitudes which you found in the Deep South, which was to a large extent found in what I call soft racism. and that is resentment of black people taking their factory jobs, black people getting welfare, black crime in the inner city. And so as a result, they have negative views, and I'm talking now about a lot of these, the MAGA people in these swing states are very much angry at the Democratic Party as they perceive as supporting the worst elements of the black population in this country, which also includes abortion. Abortions are far more likely to be have abortions with black women than white women. So these are the cultural issues. So you've got, the first one was slavery and the Civil War. The second are the cultural issues. But what's interesting is you also have this other alignment, which is with big business. Big business has always been the backbone of the Republican Party, really starting to a large extent with the Grant administration. And I have to pause this because a certain French dog who lives in my house, I don't know how he ever got here, is whining because he wants something. Yes, yes, you're right. I'm describing you as well. But can you hear him in there? Right. Say that again, Francois. I don't think anybody heard you. You weren't loud enough in your complaint. So I'm going to pause this, deal with his latest, and I'll be right back if I can remember where I was. Okay, so you can relax. He just wanted to go outside and lie on his beach towel in the patio. He's a dog. Dogs don't get suntans. I'm whispering because I don't want to tell him that. Unbelievable. He's also a big MAGA guy. And the other day he told me to order, to go online to Amazon and order him a MAGA collar. So what I did was I found a company that made a MAGA collar. It looked like a MAGA collar, but it was actually blue. So it's really like it's an anti-MAGA collar. He's got really good ears because I don't know if you've seen a picture of him. He's got these big, he's a French bulldog. He's got these great big pointy ears. And he hears everything. So I got to be really careful what I say about it. Okay, now let's get back to my subject, which is, I always wonder about these trends. Why do people vote the way they do? So the other part of this Republican Party, as they start to say, is the big business, which has been really aligned with the Republican Party, really going back to the Grant administration, and a lot of the a lot of people don't realize this, but the Credit Mobilier scandal, with which I'm sure you're familiar, and if you're not, go look it up. It'll show your ignorance. So Credit Mobilier was a big scandal in the Grant administration, involved big business people buying, influence in the government. What people don't know is that Credit Mobilier scandal, the events took place during the Lincoln administration, not the Grant administration, but Grant got the blame for it, as he did for many things, because Grant was sort of an absentee president. And you should read Grant's memoirs sometime. They're outstanding, and he was a wonderful person. But he wasn't political. So they put him in the White House, the Republicans did, and then they just used him to do whatever they wanted to do, and he didn't know any better. Yeah. So he just kind of sat there, and while these people took over, and particularly the big culprit in this was Senator Conklin from New York, who basically was the architect of the spoils system, and he was really the one who was always leading these forces, and he was a big Grant supporter, not because he liked Grant, but because he liked what he and his big business cronies were able to accomplish, basically behind Grant's back. And then you had the struggle that went on within the Republican Party all the way up to President Taft, with people like Teddy Roosevelt and Sherman, General Sherman's baby brother of the Sherman Antitrust Act, but also people like the Secretary of State under Lincoln, who bought us Alaska, and that's William Seward. And I actually practiced law for a short period of time with Seward's great-grandson, who was a patent lawyer, as was Seward. I hear people say Abraham Lincoln was a patent lawyer. No, Abraham Lincoln wasn't a patent lawyer. I'm a patent lawyer. I know what a patent lawyer is. Seward was a patent lawyer. His great-grandson was a patent lawyer. Lincoln had a patent, and it was a patent on something having to do with Robert Fulton's steamship, but it was not a very good patent, and he never got any place with it. But at one point in time, Lincoln actually had a patent case, and that's how he met Seward, because somebody told him, bring Seward in to help you. He's a patent lawyer, and that's how those two got together and then became fast friends, even though they ran against each other for the Republican nomination. Someday I'll tell you that whole story, but that was a wild convention, and Lincoln essentially stole it. But then he made Seward his Secretary of State, and Seward got repaid by an attempted assassination on the night they killed Lincoln. They also tried to kill Seward. But Seward was a liberal Republican of the day, more liberal actually than Abraham Lincoln, and he was always in a constant battle between the forces of Conkling and, of course, Elihu Root and Lincoln's Secretary of War, Stanton. All of those people were just basically big business whores. So that's really when that whole battle in the Republican Party started. It culminated with Teddy Roosevelt trying to enforce the antitrust laws. Then he unwisely decided not to run for re-election. His Vice President Taft took over, and Taft then was the ultimate big business whore, and the Rockefellers, Carnegies, Mix, Mellons, Fricks, all of those people, they were thrilled, and that's when the Republican Party became today's modern Republican Party. The Democratic Party evolved with the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt, who basically adopted Teddy Roosevelt's platforms and programs. So there you have it. So that was the split between the Republican Party that popped them off in the direction of big business. In the meantime, the South, as you all know, stayed as a bastion of the Democrats until what happened? Until Harry Truman came out and he integrated the services. And that infuriated people in the South. That's why Strom Thurmond ran against Truman for president. And this was the beginning of the turning of the South to the Republican Party, and of course culminated with the Civil Rights Act, with Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy vigorously enforcing it and going after the Klan. And then Lyndon Johnson carried forward and brought Kennedy's proposed Civil Rights Act to fruition and signed it into law. And incidentally, I remember very well when Jack Kennedy gave his beautiful civil rights speech. It was, I believe it was in June before he was assassinated, and it was really powerful. And I remember my dad, who was never a fan of the civil rights movement. He liked Martin Luther King, but he was never supportive of the movement. I remember we talked after that Kennedy speech, and he said, Kennedy's got a point there. We have been unfair. And it's like, wow, if Kennedy could turn my dad, he is a pretty good president. Of course, Dad loved Kennedy anyway. And he actually knew Joe Kennedy, which is Jack Kennedy's older brother, in World War II. They were both in the Army Air Corps. So, and they were both college football stars, and they were both Irish Catholics from prominent families. Yeah, I know, it's hard to believe, but I had a prominent family. Well, don't blame me, crying out loud. I've had to deal with lots of things in my life, First of all, I'm not that smart. I am fashionable, as you can tell. But, these things, they cut against you in life. Otherwise, I'd be prominent too. But, well, speaking of prominent, though, you probably don't know this. Well kept secret. I was king of the prom. So I guess you could say I was a prominent. Oh, come on. You don't have to turn me off just because I told one lousy bad joke. It's the only bad joke I've ever told my whole life. So, you had the Republican Party out here that was basically whores of big business for my whole lifetime. And now they're whores, particularly of the oil companies and the gun companies. All these people who do things that are contrary to what the public wants, but they don't care because that's where they get their funds. So now you've got this coming together of the South and the Republican wealthy class. And I've represented a lot of those Republican wealthy class. And right now, I'm living in Florida, which used to be a Democratic state, but it's not anymore. You know why? Because so many of those prominent wealthy people moved from blue states like New York, came down here and brought their political views with them. And I've represented, Fortune 500 companies. And most of the heads of those companies, ironically, were tended to be pretty liberal. I've also represented a lot of companies that were not Fortune 500 companies, but they were multi-million-dollar companies, often started by independent business people who made a lot of money and done very well for themselves, and they really don't like the Democratic Party, and they really are solid Republicans. And why? What is it that those people that I used to represent, and they're not in the South, they're all over the place, a lot of them in California, why is it that, what do they have in common? What is the unifying thread? I should have been a professor. Unify, or at least have my own TV show, not this crappy thing that nobody watches. I know you're watching, and I'm not putting you down, but I also know you're watching because your soap operas aren't showing right now. You ever heard of reruns? Oops, I shouldn't have said that. I don't have any audience. This is turning out to be a really horrible day. So this thread that these people have, what is it? They don't like the federal government for very totally different reasons. But it comes down to the same thing. In the South, they still think that the federal government came down and took their slaves away. Worse, the federal government came in the 60s and took away their ability to discriminate against black people with the Civil Rights Act. And then the Voting Rights Act, which gave black people more voting power. So they resent the federal government, which they associate with the Democratic Party, because it was always under the leadership of the Democrats, coming into their states. And there's a reason that the rallying cry of the Southerners, of the white Southerners in the 60s, was states' rights. It was also the rallying cry of the Confederacy, states' rights, which means states' rights to discriminate. And who took away their states' rights to discriminate? The federal government. And that, incidentally, goes all the way back to well before the Revolutionary War. I can remember, having long talks with George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. They were both from Virginia. They were both slave owners, and they were saying, we can't. We've got to make sure that I can't bring Virginia along, and we certainly can't bring in South Carolina and North. We can't bring these people along unless they are comfortable that, one, they'll have a right to continue their slaves. Two, the government's going to be split up enough so that we southern states have enough power that we can prevent the federal government from coming in. That was before there was a federal government. From coming in, the anti-slave colonies, and taking away and disrupting our way of life. So this goes all the way back, and back to when I was just a teenager when all that was going on. And I know what you're thinking. Yeah, well then how did you know George Washington? And because they were teenagers too. They were a little older than I was. I was like 14 and they were like 17, 18. But, I got where they were coming from. Not that we hung out together. We didn't hang out together. We didn't hang out with people who wore wigs and tight pants. How they got that started. And that's when it started. It started when these guys were in high school. And I remember all those founding fathers running around in those ridiculous outfits. They put them on as protests against their parents who were conservatively dressed, like I am right now, with the same kind of shirt. They're just strange people, those founding fathers, as they called themselves back then. But anyway, that whole issue of states' rights, slavery, versus northern blue states, the federal government, that's why today you have all the South is solid red. Well, what does that have to do with all these wealthy business people in the Northeast and in the Midwest and in California and all these other places, especially in my backyard here in Florida? Same thing. But their resentment of the federal government goes back to General Sherman's baby brother, Senator Sherman, who pushed through, with the help of all of those liberal Republicans in those days, the antitrust laws. And incidentally, for those of you who are patent lawyers, yeah, I know there's some patent lawyers watching this thing. I'm a patent lawyer. I actually wrote a paper for the Practicing Law Institute, which is an institute that provides education, continuing education for lawyers, about the evolution of the antitrust laws. And a lot of people out there think that the patent laws evolved from the antitrust laws. It's just the other way around. The patents are in the Constitution. Antitrust isn't in the Constitution. So it's interesting to read the evolution of the antitrust laws. And ironically, the judge who was most responsible for that on the Supreme Court was the same judge who wrote the Dred Scott decision, which many people credit as really, causing the Civil War to come to reach a boiling point. And Dred Scott, if you recall, was a runaway slave, and that hearing, that matter was actually heard in the courthouse in St. Louis, Missouri. It's still there, and the judge in that case, I'm trying to think of his name. That's what happens when you get to be old, but you wouldn't remember it anyway. But he wrote the decision that says that Dred Scott was a runaway slave. He was captured, and they didn't want to send him back. And he said, no, he's got to go back. He's property. And everybody said, that's outrageous, and he was widely criticized for that decision. Those of you who are so inclined to castigate that judge, what I got to is that's the judge who really laid the foundation for the antitrust laws evolving from the patent laws. I just thought that was ironic because he was considered very liberal, as a very liberal justice in his days, in his day. You should read the Dred Scott decision because what he said, I'm going to put this really in a quick nutshell. This judge was I just got to stop drinking that early in the morning. I should wait until at least 9 o'clock. So, not 9 o'clock at night, you morons, 9 o'clock in the morning. Do you think I'm a priest? Oh no, that's a bad example. Oh well. So, what he said was, look, I don't like slavery. He had slaves, but he gave them away. But the Constitution was written primarily with the influence of the English, and the English were royal bigots. And the English did not believe that black people were people. And that's why we have in the Constitution that basically they're property. And much as I don't like it, I have to follow the Constitution. He was one of these original literalists. And under the Constitution, this guy didn't have individual rights. The rights in the Constitution don't apply to black people because black people are not people. And that was the attitude, and he said that was the actual attitude of the Founding Fathers, which they got from the English. Black people are not people, they don't have individual rights. This man was property, and he has to go back, even though I don't like it, and even though it's a strange view in today's enlightened days, in the 1860, 1859, something in the 1850s. He said, even though I don't like it, and we today find that really kind of a weird idea, nonetheless, that's how the Founding Fathers saw it, and we have an obligation to be true to the Constitution as written and intended by the Founding Fathers. And so, I'm not a bad guy, I'm anti-slavery, I think it's a terrible outlook, but I took an oath to uphold the Constitution, and therefore I have to rule the way I did. You should read that decision because it's a real eye-opener. And particularly for those people today who say, well, I'm a fundamentalist. I think the Constitution should be applied as it was written and as it was intended by the Founding Fathers. Well, that's the perfect example of why you shouldn't do that. And that really, many people say that led to our Civil War. But anyway, I don't know why I can't remember his name. I'm just spacing out on it. It's like floating around the back of my head. And as soon as this is over, I'll remember. And then it will be too late because you'll all be back in bed. So, but in any event, that's that evolution of the whole the antitrust laws came from patent law. That's for you patent lawyers out there. But the antitrust laws that was the straw that broke the camel's back for the Republican Party because because once Taft came along and said, basically, we're not enforcing the antitrust laws, and the big business went out because what they were angry about was the federal government, again, that nasty federal government enforcing the antitrust laws. And then along came Roosevelt, and they went crazy, and then the federal government really started messing around with big business. They told them, you can only work children for so many hours in a day, so you have to pay people a minimum wage. All of these horrible things, all of these things where they were interfering and getting in the way of business people who just wanted to make a dishonest dollar. And that's when the real antipathy for the Republicans developed into this anti-federal government attitude. They were taking away their ability to make money. And then not to mention the fact that they were taxing them. And we've talked about this before. Republicans are cut taxes for the wealthiest people whenever they possibly can. They cut back on regulations. They don't enforce regulations. Ronald Reagan basically brought the enforcement of the antitrust laws to a screeching halt. I had to fight with George Bush Jr.'s Justice Department when they opposed me in the Supreme Court, intervening in a case of mine that had nothing to do with them because they were trying to undermine the antitrust laws. This is where that whole anti-government movement within the Republican Party came to fruition. So you have the anti-government attitude on behalf of the Republican Party because they're so closely aligned with big businesses and special interests, and the southern states over here are so much against the federal government coming in and getting in the way of their treatment of black people. So they both have a common enemy: the federal government and the Democratic parties using the federal government to enforce values that are antithetical to the values of the Deep South and the Republican business whores. So that's what they have in common. So what does that have to say about abortion? Well, when Rockefeller was governor of New York and Ronald Reagan was governor of California, as I mentioned the other day, they both signed into the Constitution, embedded in the Constitution of those two states, Roe versus Wade. So why would they do that when the Republican Party is so anti-abortion? Because before Nixon's Southern strategy kicked into full force, the Republican Party, consistent with its anti-federal government and anti-government intervention rules and regulations and views, also viewed the government's imposition of certain people's moral values on the private decisions of people, of women in particular, but families, regarding abortion. They viewed that as another government intrusion into their private lives. So consistent with the Republican view that the government should stay out of things, they also felt the government should stay out of the abortion issue. That was the way the Republicans, by and large, looked at it back then. What's coming home to haunt the Republicans is, by and large, the Republican middle class feels the same way today. That's why they lost. That's why the pro-abortion, pro-choice forces were successful in Kentucky, and they were successful in Kansas, because Republican rank and file Republicans still believe that it's none of the government's damn business. So how did that happen? How did suddenly the anti-government parties in the South particularly, how did they suddenly become anti-abortion? And the answer is that when Roe versus Wade came out, you had these Southern preachers looking for an issue, because this was never an issue with the Southern Christian leadership in the South. Never an issue. Suddenly they said, well, here's an issue that we can make ourselves relevant in the political realm, because they wanted to get into, and it was Viggory, and it was all these people, Jerry Falwell. They wanted to make themselves powerful. And I said, here's an issue we can seize on. We can take this issue and we can put ourselves in the public eye. And so they started out of nowhere becoming anti-abortion. And to some extent, this was like also not so much against the federal government per se, but against the Supreme Court in those days, which they thought was also the federal government and was coming in and weighing its heavy hand on their cultural issues. So that's really how that sort of evolution came about. And now, of course, they're going to be really sorry, because if they lose this election, if Trump loses this election, it'll probably be on the abortion issue. But that's enough of my meandering. I hope I've given you something that you can use, and you'll excuse my going off on this tangent or that tangent. But one thing I always try to do is, no matter what tangent I go back on, I come back to my central thread. And that's something that I think I've learned to do for my years of trying cases, where you're always being pulled off of your direct examination or your presentation by somebody coming in with some testimony or something that's irrelevant, and you've got to focus on that, but then you have to be able to come back to your central theme, and I try to do that. And I hope in so doing I haven't bored you to tears, or maybe offended you, probably a little of both. I'm sorry. I really am.